In quantum physics, creative insight is the quantum leap. I mean, what quantum physics does, Newtonian physics has blinded us into believing that the world really is local. No communication is possible without signal. World is continuous. Everything is connected with everything else in a continuous way in time. Nothing is discontinuous, happening with discontinuity in time. We cannot connect the past with the present, those kind of situations, which we call quantum leaps. When an electron jumps from one atomic orbit to another, it does not go through the intervening space. You cannot give any causal reason of when the electron will jump and where it will jump.
Which is one of the theories regarding the fossil gap, right?
Yeah, which is exactly what defines which explains the fossil gap. There must have been quantum leaps of evolution. Exactly. So these quantum leaps occur in creativity, and that is the major difference between quantum theory of creativity versus ordinary theories of creativity. They think it's all, we figure it out. We figure out everything. We figure out everything because some people have access to deep levels of the brain, which other people don't, which is all nonsense. Brain is brain, and there is access is achieved by memorizing. And yes, some people have good memory, but that does not make them creative necessarily. So the basic point then is that this discontinuity has to be emphasized in addition to continuity in our education.
Welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Cuedu, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and also global healing. And we draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science and consciousness, spirituality, healing, philosophy. And in addition to hosting guest speakers, we also offer classes and study groups also on Zoom. So we have about 150 video recordings on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. They're also accessible on our website, which is caritascenter.org. And as a nonprofit, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep Caritas going. So if you'd like to support our program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. And now I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Amit Goswami, professor, researcher, best-selling author, theoretical physicist, quantum science pioneer, spiritual practitioner. Dr. Goswami is a retired professor from the physics department at the University of Oregon from 1968 to 1997. He's a renowned pioneer of the new paradigm of quantum science based on the primacy of consciousness. He has written many groundbreaking popular books based on research in quantum science and consciousness. And in 2009, Amit started a movement called quantum activism, which we will talk about today also. And that is now gaining ground in North and South America, Europe, and India, and probably Brazil too, which is where he is right now. In 2019, he and his collaborators established Quantum Activism Vishwalayam. I don't know if I said that right, Vishwalayam, acting as Department of Quantum Science at the University of Technology in Jaipur, India, and developed a master and Ph.D. program in quantum science of health, prosperity, and happiness, an international program of transformative education. Dr. Goswami was featured in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? And the documentaries The Dalai Lama Renaissance and The Quantum Activist. He's a spiritual practitioner and calls himself a quantum activist in search of wholeness. His new book, The Ascent of Humanity, Quantum Biology, and Our Future, is the one we'll be discussing today. I just finished reading it, and it was exciting. So, welcome, Amit. May I call you Amit?
Of course.
This is your second time with
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And we'll get right to our questions. That I have so many questions that I jotted down as I was reading through your book. And I guess we'll just start with what was it that inspired you to write this Ascent of Humanity, and how does it build on your previous work in quantum science and consciousness?
You know, the Darwin's theory of evolution, although very popular, and biologists pretend that it is the final word on evolution, is very incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
And the most incomplete part of it is that it is completely based on scientific materialism.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is matter. Although that interpretation is not the only interpretation, another interpretation can be given, which I did find later, which is included in the book that we are going to discuss. But most biologists think that Darwin's theory supports scientific materialism, lock, stock, and barrel. So if that is the case, then of course, I, being a quantum physicist, having discovered the fact that quantum physics suggests a different worldview, not the one based on the primacy of matter, but one based on primacy of consciousness. So I was determined to see if Darwin's theory is actually the final word, as they say. I wanted to find out, okay, what Darwin's theory does not explain. And is there any other theory, competing theory, which has been ignored by the biological community? And the answer that I found is yes on both scores. Yes, Darwin's theory does not agree with many important pieces of data, for which only flimsy, imaginary, pseudoscientific explanation can be given by the biological community. And on top of it, there is an alternative theory of evolution, which of course also has its own problems. And that is why biologists have been successfully ignoring it. But I thought I could solve those problems with this alternative theory, which is due to Lamarck, a very notable biologist himself. His theory actually preceded Darwin's theory. But his theory was never popular because an aspect of Darwin's theory that something can be hereditary transmitted, that was not available for Lamarck's theory. Lamarck's theory, it was very difficult to see how the Lamarckian changes are transmitted from one generation to another. So that was the main problem. I solved the latter problem in this book. And having solved that, we now see that a new theory of a reconciliation of Darwinism and Lamarckism must take place of the standard Darwin's theory that is called neo-Darwinism. And when we do that, something very remarkable happens. Darwin's theory is one of the defects is that although the biological fossil data shows clearly that there is a progression in the development of fossils, development of species, progression in terms of simplicity to complexity. In other words, biological evolution gives us an arrow of time. By looking at evolution, we can tell which way the time goes, because as time advances, the fossils are going to be more complex. Darwin's theory has no explanation for that.
nor for the gap, right? The fossil gap.
And the fossil gap, of course, is a major difficulty with Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory has no explanation for the fossil gap. But coming back to this arrow of time, this arrow of time suggests that there is a future of humanity and we can talk about the future. Biologists generally say that we cannot talk about the future. Future could be anything because biological evolution go to complexity or simplicity, we cannot say. But this new theory says that no, it has to go towards complexity, and complexity is necessary in order for organisms to be better able to enjoy, explore life. Life does not end with mere survival. Life has meaning and purpose. Although only human beings are good at exploring meaning and purpose, but even animals, some animals have a little bit of meaning and purpose. Once in a while, we find that to our amazement. But there is nothing to be amazed about because meaning and purpose is the future of humanity. And then this is really what I emphasize in the second half of the book, the future of humanity.
Yes, that was a very exciting part of the book for me. I think most people are familiar with Darwin's theory. Would you explain Lamarck's theory for those of us who are not familiar with it?
Okay, so Darwin's theory is based on gene mutation, chance mutation, and natural selection. Nature selects among those mutations which help the organisms to survive better. That's Darwin's theory. Lamarck, on the other hand, said that the characteristics that evolve, that they are developed during the life of the organism itself. It's propagation of acquired characteristic. In other words, one theory is proposing something new eventually called gene, which is what determines the propagation. And genes are shown to be hereditary. That is Darwin's credit, that he predicted something that was found out later that it is correct. Genes are hereditary. We inherit our genes from our parents and so forth. On the other hand, Darwin's acquired characteristic could not be proven at that time or since until I came along with this book. Lamarck's theory could not be verified, could not be shown that the acquired characteristic have any way of being hereditary. This is the major defect of Darwin's theory. So in other words, the biologists even proved a theorem. The theorem is that information can go from genes into proteins, but information of the protein can never go to the genes. So genetic propagation, genetic inheritance will not do to propagate the inherited protein structure changes. This is the reason that Lamarck's theory gradually were abandoned by most people. But Lamarck's theory is very interesting for another reason. Lamarck's theory leaves room for consciousness. Whereas Darwin's theory, as I said, can be interpreted strictly in materialist terms. Although it doesn't have to, but can be interpreted strictly in materialist terms. But Darwin's theory leaves room for consciousness. So I was very interested in Lamarck's theory leaves room for consciousness. So I was very interested in Lamarck's theory for that reason as well.
Did he have any kind of theory about something equivalent to Teilhard de Chardin's Noosphere? Was anything like that in Lamarck's theory?
You mean Neosphere, did you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the Teilhard de Chardin's theory. No, that's a spiritual theory. Okay.
Isn't that like non-locality? That's how I always saw it.
Yes. Non-locality comes into the idea of Neosphere. The idea of noosphere, biosphere, noosphere is very good idea. Very good idea because we know that there's a distinct difference between animals and human beings. But these differences have not been very clear in the history of biology. When Darwin founded his theory, it was not at all clear that humans are nothing but animals.
Mhm.
In fact, that's what he proposed, that humans are animals, we are from monkeys, and we remain kind of animals. We are no better.
Mm.
Although we have all this technology, etc., but that is our characteristic. Monkeys have their own technology, gorillas have their own technology, so we are not superior because we have built airplanes. So this is the view that biologists have. And whereas when I looked at Teilhard de Chardin's theory, then it really is very inspiring because he's saying that first there is biosphere, where the biological beings are, biological vital energies are the issue at the points of issue. But then there is noosphere, thinking. And it is thinking that creates a new sphere. And thinking, it is the thinking mind of the human. So it clearly distinguishes, okay, here are animals, and then there is the human. And eventually human will be ending up to be superhuman, which is the another garden of Eden will come about.
When you reach the omega point, right? Yeah. Would you explain the role of consciousness in the quantum worldview, especially in contrast to materialist science?
Yeah, how consciousness comes into the world of the quantum is a very, very important issue. And actually, it's very simple to explain. There is a paradox in the way that quantum objects were revealed themselves when they were studied initially. Some experiments were showing that some of these objects are particles, like electrons and photons, but some of the experiments were also showing that they're waves. Now, waves and particles are very different objects. Waves spread, whereas particles stay put in one place. Even when they move in a trajectory along the same line, so to speak. So how to reconcile the two completely different aspects of the same object? This was called a paradox, a logical paradox that needed to be solved. Solution, however, is extremely simple when the mathematics of quantum physics was discovered, because the mathematics showed that quantum objects are waves, period. There is no doubt about it. They are waves. They are not particles, they are waves. But
Until
of course,
observed.
but
Right.
of course, experimentally, we never see them as waves.
Right.
Analysis shows that the experiment which suggests that they are waves, it is not that straightforward. There is a little bit of analysis that goes on, a hypothesis that goes on before we can say that, okay, this experiment is suggesting that quantum objects are waves. We never really see a quantum object as a wave in daylight. We never do. So where are they residing? This is the proposition that changes our worldview. Where they reside must be outside of space and time. You mentioned non-locality before. This is where non-locality comes in. Non-locality can happen only outside of space and time. Space and time are local. Signals are required to communicate. Outside of space and time, non-locality is allowed. Signals are not needed to communicate. This is the difference between the two domains of reality. And once we understand that waves are waves in a domain of potentiality, non-local domain, and particles are objects when we see them in space and time, then everything becomes clear. this non-local domain is what our consciousness is. Ordinarily, it is unconscious. When we observe, unconscious becomes conscious. Particle, wave become particle.
And the spiritual, the corresponding spiritual effort that we have when we meditate or we practice mindfulness, in which we want to connect on that non-local level. We want to, there's a spiritual part of us, right, that is only accessible on that level. And so how does quantum science, or does it help us to achieve that?
Yes, this is a very good question.
Uh-huh.
How does quantum physics help us to understand spirituality? So if quantum physics is this non-local domain of reality, then it follows that everything in this non-local domain of reality are connectable without signals. Now, who can connect with you without signal? Think about it. Only you. Only you can connect with you without signal. You don't need a signal to communicate with yourself, right? So quantum physics is tacitly saying that this domain of potentiality is a domain of potential unity. All objects really are ultimately potentially one. This is where spirituality begins, this oneness. And then, of course, explicitly, the problem is how that oneness breaks up into two, subject and object, in an experience. Because in an experience, there is the subject, I see you, you are the object, I am the subject. So how does that split? Oneness breaks up into two. This was a major problem for me to solve. I solved it by suggesting that brain has a special mechanism called tangled hierarchy that traps consciousness into thinking, into illusorily thinking that I am separate from the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's really not a real separateness, but an apparent separateness. And then we are conditioning reflection in the mirror of memory, because every experience must be memorized. We have reflection in the mirror of memory. Consciousness becomes more and more forgetful of its origin in unity. So by the time we become our ego, the consciousness that we usually experience, by that time we have forgotten that we all come from that oneness. This is why there is so much division among people, there is so much competition, domination, what have you. So the spirit, how to reach the spirit? Go over the forgetfulness. How to go over the forgetfulness? The ancient people had the right idea. Meditate. And we have quantum physics has added one more thing. Meditate and be creative. Creative meditation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. And there have been times in our history where we were more connected to non-locally, to each other, to the higher self. What happened?
I am convinced, and the recent data is supporting this view, that about 70,000 years ago, we became what is called self-domesticated.
Self-domesticated.
We became different from animals. Domesticated animals are different from wild animals. But the question is, if humans domesticate animals, but who domesticated humans? Humans must have, if there's nobody else around. So the self-domestication idea that culminated with success about 70,000 years ago. Now, what happens in self-domestication is a suspension of the animosity or the defensiveness that I feel when I see a stranger. Self-domestication is the ability of temporarily suspending that animosity, that defensiveness, temporarily suspending our immune response. So this is what we call the action of the archetype of goodness. We embody a little bit of the archetype of goodness in us. We become a little bit good, in other words, in self-domestication. And then some of us started a project of further exploring the archetype of goodness. They developed altruism and compassion and all that. And because in those days we are not in much on thinking mind, but feelings, emotions were the major vehicle through which we communicated. And emotions are very non-local, susceptible to non-locality. So that's how humanity were quite connected at that time. In fact, I have proposed, the book has not come out yet. We are in the process of writing another book in which I suggest that that is what we call Garden of Eden. This time that we are connected. So we really falling from a Garden of Eden ever since. That biblical story is the mythology, which is actually telling part of the truth of the development of our soul. William Marvin Thompson, a great philosopher, he once said that mythology is the story of our soul, history of our soul. I completely agree. So that Garden of Eden mythology should not be thrown away as just wild imagination. It really has truth in it. And the truth is that we were connected at some point. Feminine anthropologists already call this period a period of golden age of humanity. And I think they're right too. It is the golden age when people are connected, there are peace in vast regions of the world. Of course, the world was pretty small at that time. There was no communication between different parts of the world. All that is true. But the parts that were connected, they were connected in a peaceful way. People did not fight with each other.
And it was egalitarian as well.
All that changed when thinking entered in a major way. And that's the beginning of the agricultural society. With agricultural society, a person can own a huge amount of land, and that ownership brings in the concept of private property, and that brings in the concept of rich and poor. And once that was created, a stratification of society, elitism became rampant. And once that happens, then that egalitarianism of everybody is one, everybody is connected, that cannot coexist with it.
The ego becomes solidified, right?
Ego becomes solidified, exactly. So the separateness becomes the dominant outlook. Everybody is looking more for more separateness, not less separateness. Today, look at the society. Every day we hear another item which is making us more separate. Instead of going towards more unity, which we are going towards more separate. Of course, consciousness has antidote built in. Antidote is reincarnation. So some of us have reincarnated many times before, and we are not persuaded by the separatist philosophy that easily. So it's about 15% of the people, they carry on the job of spiritual unity. And this is why you still find that you exist, I exist, and our audience exists, and they're quite large number.
Yes, you point out in the book, 15% is 1 billion people right now, yes. Right? So that's that's very heartening. And it made me think of the Maharishi effect, but Maharishi Mahesh Yogi said, didn't he say 1% was critical mass?
Yeah, he did say something like that. And in fact, it's a spiritual tradition. There is a lower that if 1% of the people were
Meditating.
spiritual, then things could change. But it's all a guess. I think it is much more than 1% right now.
Yeah, because
course,
I always thought once we reach this critical mass, whatever it is, whether it's 1% or 10% or 15%, then everything has to shift. Everything has to change, and I thought of it. I was hoping it would be like the Berlin Wall, just this overnight shift, but clearly that's not what has happened. Even though we're at 15%, there's no overnight shift.
No, because the 15% is very divided. I mean, the point is that we don't have any mechanism to unite the 15%. We have been talking about community building since the 1980s, but nobody has succeeded. And, you mentioned in the introduction that we have this University of Transformation. We get masters and PhD. We're hoping that we will develop a community. But so far, the success is very limited. People are busy today. People are spend too much time in terms of survival. The cost of survival has gone up enormously, and it's only going up even more with the movement of consciousness, the way it's going. So it is very hard to see that people don't have enough time. This is what people need. They need to give less time to survival and more time to meaning and purpose. But this is not
And how do we do that? How do we create more time for meaning and purpose?
Exactly.
Well, maybe, I don't know. What came to my mind was, can AI help us with that?
No, artificial intelligence goes in the opposite direction, unfortunately. AI can help us in a limited way. If we can define a problem completely with rational thinking, and then on the basis, we can use the AI to find a solution. That we can do. But what involves in transformation is mostly what we call fundamental creativity. Archetypal creativity, creativity in search of meaning and purpose. Computers cannot process meaning. So the changes that we are talking about, spiritual change, is outside of the domain of computers.
Yeah, well, yes, obviously, yes. I was just thinking in terms of alleviating some of the survival emphasis by
one thing computers can do, though, computers can free us from, we spend a lot of time solving trivia, solving our survival problems.
Yeah,
computers can help us survive better.
That's what I was. That's what I was asking.
Computers in the right way, not in the way that we are doing now. Now it's all rich poor divide, and only the rich has access to computers and AI. Ordinary people don't have access. But if, on the other hand, we make it universally accessible, like something like internet, we already have done it once. Internet is universally accessible. Similarly, if we could make AI universally accessible in a cheap way so that this rich-poor division do not exist, then, of course, what will happen is that people will solve their survival problems with the help of AI. And they will free a lot of time, and that time they can devote to meaning and purpose. So I'm very hopeful that that's what's going to happen in the future. AI is going to liberate us from the survivability problem.
That's what I'm hoping too. It's a double-edged sword. It depends how we use it, right? Let's talk about the brain's negativity bias, how it blocks our emotional evolution, and how can we overcome it? Where did it come from? How did we end up with this bias, and how can we overcome it?
Well, survival requires a lot of competition. competition cannot be eliminated from the equation of survival. So survival means that there are going to be organisms, and some organisms are going to threaten some other organisms, which is its food. And those organisms have to resort to flight or fight. And those flight and fight are going to become conditioned, and they're going to become brain circuits when the organisms have developed brain. I'm talking about mammalian organisms now. So this is the story. And once that develops, then from that simple equation of flight and fight, which is based on fear, you get lust, you get violence, you get domination, you get competition, you get all the negative emotions, jealousy, anger, all of the negative emotions develop from these very simple dynamics. So these dynamics we have inherited from the animals. Instincts. Instincts means millions of years of conditioning. And that's not easy to overcome. When we get into the throes of instinctual anger or instinctual competitiveness or instinctual domination, then we are hopeless unless we have a positive emotion equally strong that will compensate for it. So, for example, we have balance of negative emotion built into us as an instinct, but those human beings 70,000 years ago, they conquered that partially by self-domesticating themselves, by deciding that, no, we can be vulnerable for a while. We don't have to be immediately aggressive or immediately run away. So in this way, gradually, some of us have developed the ability of controlling these negative emotions. These are the people who are the moral leaders of the society. Martin Luther King or similar people, Dalai Lama. These are people who have that spiritual power to control their negative emotions.
Being aware of it helps. Being aware that the brain has this bias, so that when we feel negativity, we can make another choice, or we can choose to focus on a more positive archetype, or try to shift how we're thinking about whatever it is that is triggering that negativity, in order to balance or counterbalance or overcome.
That is the basic idea. But initially, people thought that they can check the negativity only through thinking. What happens is that we have ability of seeing with the midbrain as well as the cortex. And
I'm sorry.
Midbrain.
The midbrain.
We have sort of three brains. The top brain is called cortex. The middle brain is called limbic brain or midbrain, and the innermost brain is called reptilian brain. So the midbrain, that also has capacities. So whereas the forebrain capacity is with thinking, midbrain's capacity is with feeling.
Yes.
They cognize with feeling. And midbrain sees a stimulus faster before the cortex can see the stimulus. This was experimentally found by a neurophysiologist named Damasio back in the 1990s. Very important data, that midbrain can see a stimulus faster than the forebrain, and therefore can act faster with the negative emotions. So before we even think, we already have become negative. Only way to control this is positive emotion. We have to get to the midbrain and change the midbrain, or part of the cortex and junction of cortex and midbrain. We have to build positive emotional brain circuit, which is as fast as the negative emotions can receive
Yeah.
the equally fast.
Yeah. We can also utilize neuroplasticity, right?
Yeah, of course. All this is because of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is how we build positive emotional brain circuits. I mean, if the neurons could not be changed, then we would be forever stuck with these negative emotions, and that's it.
Right.
But that is not true. We have neuroplasticity, so we can make new brain circuits of positive emotion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Neuroplasticity is the key word here.
Okay. And I think we can consciously do things like gratitude exercises and, shifting our emotional response to things when we recognize what the automatic, how we react automatically, and then, pull back and shift it, right? The more we're aware of it, the more we can change it.
Yes.
Yes. So
these practices are quite simple, and spiritual traditions have been talking about these practices from ages.
Yes.
And some cultures, I mean, you mentioned Brazil before, I mentioned Brazil before. We both like Brazilians because Brazilians have a lot of that ability, more or less, very large number of Brazilians. I'm not saying universal. By no means. Brazil also is a very violent country in some ways, but
a lot of poverty.
About 20% to 30% Brazilians, they really are much more positive emotional than you find in North America or Europe.
Yes, yes. Well, there's that ancient myth of I don't know that I would call it a myth, but it's called the Eagle and the Condor. Are you familiar with that? The eagle, like the bird, right? The eagle and the condor. It was, I can't remember when it got started. It was like a prophecy, right? And it was maybe 1,000 years ago or something. And the prophecy was that the eagle represented the rational mind and the intellect and the quest for power that goes with it. And the condor represented the heart-centered spiritual understanding, spiritual wisdom. And the prophecy said that around the year 1500, that the eagle would, the condor would take flight and from North America to South America. They both had both, but around the year 1500, 1492 was Columbus, right? That the condor would take flight and refuge in South America, and that North America, I don't know what they called it at that time, but the northern part of the continent would embrace the eagle more and more and more and more and more. And then the prophecy was that around the year 2000, it would be critical for the North Americans to reinvite the condor, which was happily living in South America, where they have this heart-centered spiritual wisdom, and that it was very important that North America would reintegrate the condor, and then the North Americans could help the South Americans to materially, because they had the eagle, right? Yes. Then they would help the materially, and then everyone would be happy, And I love that prophecy because it just seems very accurate and very,
Beautiful prophecy. In a way, the prophecy summarizes some of the part of the book, later parts of the book, because that's what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that the North Americans and Europeans, generally the Northern Hemisphere, has become very rational-minded.
Yes.
Even
And
women
left-brained.
traditionally are a little emotional. Even women, North American women are now ashamed of calling emotional. They want to be, only macho thinkers, thinking people, rational people, rationality. So indeed, the time is about right when this has to change.
Yeah.
When this changes, what happens is something very beautiful. Because remember, we talked about the Garden of Eden before? Garden of Eden was a great connectivity, but the connectivity was only with the help of positive emotion. We're not really using the thinking mind yet. In other words, without the thinking mind, we could not solve our survivability problems. The survivability problem, solution of the survivability problem is best done by the thinking mind, by the rational mind. So now we have used the rational mind to solve the survivability problem. AI is the last example. And with that, now we can quit on survivability and pay attention to meaning and purpose and get positive emotion back again. So the condor can come back in North America and Europe and rest of the northern part of the hemisphere, northern hemisphere of the world. And we can get into a equalization of positive and negative in the brain. This has to happen before positive and negative become balanced. We have no chance of solving problem of anger, negative emotions, because thinking just cannot do it fast enough.
Yes. So in the book you call the vital era was the era where we developed our feelings and we were more connected to, non-locally, we were more connected to each other, maybe the higher forces, our spiritual inheritance. You emphasize also the role of archetypes and meaning in our evolution. So how do we tap into the archetypal dimensions in our personal and collective growth?
Well, but so far we have talked about only the goodness archetype, but some of the very basic archetypes cannot be left out. Like love is a very basic archetype. The Garden of Eden was created not only because we explored the goodness archetype successfully, but we explored the archetype of love also successfully. Here is the situation. Survival is a primitive instinct for us. Primitive instinct. Nothing is going to overcome our survival necessity. We are completely stuck with it. When survival is threatened, that's all that we care about. Okay, that being the case, what are the archetypes associated with survival? If you think about it, it's archetype of power and the archetype of abundance. Those are the two archetypes. But those two archetypes, when they're engaged totally in the service of survivability, they are incomplete. Their completeness depends on combining the exploration of archetype of power and abundance with the archetypes of love and goodness. This is the challenge. This challenge was called Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung. Very appropriate term because it is a heroic effort that takes to bring goodness and love in our exploration of power and abundance.
And the last stage of the hero's journey is the return, which I think the Western culture often leaves out, where the hero rides off into the sunset. But the return, I think, is very important because that's when we grow horizontally, where we can lift others up by what we have achieved on our journey, on the hero's journey, instead of just, okay, I've got my, I've got my my boon, whatever the treasure is, and now I'm gonna go home, right? It's bringing to the culture, sharing what we know, and lifting others.
In other words, giving the society a role to play in our personal life. Our person and our society are not separate. We are the society.
Mm-hmm.
When society becomes locally connected, then we seem to be separate. But society has to be non-locally connected before we see the unity of all of us. This is why the community is very important, because in small communities, we can create that sense of unity. We see in our university, by the way, in our little University of Transformational Learning, we see that not the master students so much because it takes longer, but among the PhD students, some of them do have that kind of coherent build-up of non-locality.
Mm.
That can act together. They really are part of a community. They're ready to help others, ready to help when others need help. They have a lot of compassion. They're always attentive to society, doing their job.
Is that in India? In India, the
No,
university in India?
it's an international university. Mostly on the internet. They have to
Oh,
go to India only for 10 days in a year.
oh, I see. What is the web address for that website? Is there a website?
Oh, yes. You can enter it simply with my website, amitgoswami.org.
Oh, okay.
MITGOSWAMI.org.
Mm-hmm.
There is also a special website, cqaedu.edu. That's also another website. No,
Okay.
cqaedu.com. Sorry.
And those are on your website. So if we Google you, we will also find those.
Yeah, my website is the easiest way to enter it.
Okay. What is the organization that you have in Brazil, in São Paulo?
Well, what we have here is something very interesting, synchronistic, whatever you may call it. I wrote several books, as you know, out of which one book is called Physics of the Soul. Now, this book was published by a publisher in Brazil in 2007, and it immediately became a bestseller. So the fellow became personally interested in me, and he invited me to come to Brazil, and we liked each other instantly. And that friendship is still there, and he is the one who has organized my lectures, workshops, and now both me and Valentina. So Adriano is the name of the guy, Adriano Promer. He has established a quantum academy, which works in collaboration with Center for Quantum Activism, which is the organization that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
And the two organizations are working hand in hand to promote quantum activism. We give courses.
It seems to me Brazil would be a very good place for that, because I think Brazilians are more service. I just got an error message on my computer saying it sounds like you might have switched to a different language. Oh my goodness. No, I was going to say Brazilians have a very strong sense of service.
Yes.
Yes.
Very sense of service, very strong sense of this altruism that I talk about very often.
Yeah.
That in need, Brazilians are ready to help.
Yeah.
And it really is quite amazing how that positive emotions are so easy to Brazilians to learn. Once they hear about it, they learn it quickly because they are emotional people.
Yeah.
Not necessarily all positive, both negative and positive, but once they understand the difference and once they understand that the balancing is important, then they learn to balance it pretty quickly.
Mhm. Talk to us about quantum activism. How do you define it, and how do we do it?
The ordinary activism, people try to change the world, but they themselves never bother. This is why, activistic leaders get so much part of scandals, either greed or sex or whatever have you. They never bother to change themselves. In quantum worldview, it is different. Quantum worldview realizes from the get-go that if you want to change another person, if you're going to change another person's belief system, you better have this solidly established in your own belief system that you're trying to promote. You better leave your belief system because it's you who has to exemplify what you're talking about. Otherwise, people don't get it, and because they don't get it, they make more mischief than good in ordinary activism.
So be the change you want to see, right? So it's
The change that you want to see.
yeah, and it's more of a
walk your talk is another phrase that I like. Walk your talk.
walk your talk. Yes, yes, and a spiritually informed activism, so
Yes.
that when we are working to, let's say, change something in society that we see as unjust or whatever, that if we come to it from a place of anger or fear or frustration, we add to the problem. Whereas if we come to it from a heart-centered place and a spiritually centered place, then we can do some good.
Yeah, I use the word expansion of consciousness a lot. Heart-centered automatically is an expanded consciousness. Brain can be expanded, but you need to meditate in order to make the brain expanded consciousness. So this is why meditation is very important. Meditation makes the brain cooperate with the heart, and we live in the expanded consciousness. And then all of these things that we are talking about, you mentioned humility before, we mentioned gratitude before, all those things become easy once we understand how to live in an expanded consciousness.
Yes. Yes. So, do you see signs that humanity is already beginning to ascend toward a higher consciousness? And if so, what are the signs?
Well, we are the signs. I mean, if you think about it, look, in this era where we are seeing division, countries after countries are selecting totalitarianism instead of democracy, which has a semblance of unity. We are becoming more and more separate. In spite of that, there is this millions, if not billion people exist who are into meditation, who are into consciousness expansion. So where did they come from? So there must be a design, there must be a law of science that is helping produce these people. We know that science is the science of reincarnation. So we have done a lot of work in our past life, and we have acquired a lot of characteristics from our past life that help us stay in the spiritual journey, in spite of the fact that our friends are following a different journey. So that itself is the biggest proof that there is nothing to lose heart about. There are a lot of people for us to work with. We don't have to necessarily be disheartened that, oh, nobody's going to listen to me. No, there's a lot of listeners, lots and lots of listeners. So if you especially exemplify what you are saying, then the listening happens very quickly. And this is really the proposition that I'm making. That's how humanity has to ascend.
So what would you point to as the signs that it's happening?
Well, the sign that it is actually happening, that probably will start with attending a lasting peace. That's the first thing we need. We remember after the World War II, we made a genuine effort in having lasting peace. That effort lasted only a couple of years. After that, America itself got lost in the Korean War and then Vietnam War, and then Middle East became a perpetual place of war. Then war started spreading in Europe, and Russians started absorbing countries, and war. So although we have established a world order of some sense, and that is not a mean accomplishment, certainly to be exemplified and praised, but still we have not yet been successful in making a peaceful world. Peaceful worlds happen. They have happened before, not only the Golden Age, but also happened in past Romana, happened in the King Ashoka's time in India, happened in Pericles' time in Athens in Greece. So it has happened before, and it can happen again. And the biggest sign would be that when every one of us are so tired of war and division, that we'll get into a much stabler form of peace than we are able to with the United Nations and the ideas. Because don't forget, NATO fundamentally was based on war, not the idea of peace. It was based on Cold War. The hot war was replaced by the concept of Cold War. War never disappeared in that kind of law and order. So that won't do. The war has to disappear and give way to the word peace. That's when we will see that, okay, a new era has begun.
Okay, I want to open it up in case anyone else has a question or a comment. And if you don't, I have more. Anybody want to say anything?
Yeah.
Suzanne?
Yes.
Oh.
I probably have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
You haven't used the word entanglement yet. That is a relatively new scientific fact. Isn't there an aspect of entanglement with the wholeness of spirit that we can strive for through these meditative practices?
Yeah.
Or do you have a comment about that?
You are very right. In order to have non-locality, two objects need to come together and interact locally. That interaction makes them entangled. That's the
Okay.
idea.
But what I'm talking about is a spiritual entanglement.
Yeah, spiritual entanglement can be seen as non-local, this same thing, non-local entanglement.
So there's both kinds in your opinion. Okay.
Same concept.
Yeah. Okay. I'm interested in, this process of becoming more of a feeling, heart-centered, as well as thinking person, integrating the two. And isn't part of this process about self-reflection? And there must have been some point at which some persons who maybe have been leaders became self-reflective. In other words, they use their thinking processes to look at themselves and maybe their negativity and made a conscious change to think in a different way. You hadn't used the word self-reflective, but I was thinking insight about self because we became so egoistic. And then somewhere along the line, people began seeing themselves, projecting out of themselves, or maybe others reflecting to them. Do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, you can think of it that way. We call it higher thinking. Ordinary thinking is rational thinking. It just depends on the mind giving meaning to using what is known. It is based on the exploration of the known. The key thing about higher thinking is that it categorically depends on the unknown, the archetypes. Archetypes we can never fully discover. We can never fully express what archetypes are, what exactly they are. You can only express your own experience of the archetype. So archetypes are forever new. So when thinking takes advantage of the archetypal dimension of our experience, then we are into higher thinking. And that's what you're talking about. And yes, if we can shift the mode of thinking, then that's it. That's bulk of the job. We have to go from lower thinking into higher thinking, lower negative emotions into positive emotions. These are the challenges.
Okay. Another question, and then I'll stop for others for their point of view. To me, I'm a meditator, big time, and it makes all the difference for insight for me. Do you have any recommendations? There's all different kinds. I have one that I like a lot and has been very fruitful. Do you have some recommendations on meditating?
Could you repeat? I missed part of it.
She wants to know, do you have any particular meditative exercises or practice that you recommend?
Actually, I have a whole bunch of meditation. Excuse me. I have a whole bunch of meditation that I recommend. The reason that only one type of meditation does not work is that different meditations serve different purposes.
Mm-hmm.
All meditations slow the mind down. So any meditation is better than no meditation. So concentration meditation, which is what TM practices and what is most popular, we concentrate on a word that Hindus call mantra, and we repeat and repeat, and when our mind gets distracted, we bring our mind firmly back to the mantra. This is the simple instruction of the concentration meditation. That meditation is very good for two things. One is that it brings back the parasympathetic nervous system in par with the sympathetic nervous system. And the other thing that is good about it, of course, it slows down the mind. But there is also vipassana, mindfulness, or awareness meditation, being aware that I am watching my thoughts. These meditations are also very important because they help us recognize who I am, what is creating these divisions in me, and how to bridge that gap, how to create a situation in which I can leave my attachment to all my thoughts and instead go towards emptiness where there is no thought. And there is a more, but let me not go any further because the more further we go, the more complex it becomes. And unless you do the practice, it's very hard to comprehend what I'm trying to say.
Okay, yeah, I do Buddhist practices, the Chinese, actually. And I just want to say, because others may have questions, I just wanted to say thank you for now. And if there's still time, I might have a couple more later.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Paul, do you have a question or a comment? You're muted. You have to unmute.
Yes, I did. And I'm going to go back to the first of the lecture, and I'm going to risk becoming rational for a moment. So, so my question was, when we think about epigenetics, is that an indication that Lamarckian theory is correct? That was it.
Epigenetics plays a very important role in our work because epigenetics was the first indication that there should be a non-physical body called the vital body along with the physical body in order to form an organ. In other words, physical body is the hardware of the organ, but what provides the software, the instructions of how to operate the hardware. Those instructions are in the form of the vital. And the hint of that was that the instructions for which genes would be switched on in which organ are epigenetic. They're not part of the nuclear genes. They're outside of the genes. And therefore, the question is, how are this epigenetic material, how are they activated, these quantum gene activators? How are they activated? Which activates them? And the answer is that consciousness activates them parallelly with activation of what Rupert Sheldrake called morphogenetic fields. And these morphogenetic fields then give us the vital software.
Very good. Thank you. And I just wanted to comment, I've read much of your work, so I really appreciate the fact that you are here today.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else? Nobody? Okay, well, I have a question. What is the one shift in mindset that you would most like your readers to take away from this book?
Well, one shift is very hard to talk about, but if you really insist, then I would have to say that think about living in expanded consciousness. It is the consciousness that excludes, that is totally me-centered, that I am everything. This is the most ruinous aspect of spirituality. It ruins spirituality completely because I'm becoming a closed system into myself. It closes up relationship. I cannot relate with another person because that person is just an object. I'm the only subject, and so on and so forth. So the biggest incentive should be in expanding consciousness so that the other can be given a meaning. That yes, I am there, but other is also there. Just as I am here, the other is also there in a legitimate way, as legitimate as me. Although the other I perceive as separate, but the other is not an object. And so all these vials of the society, domination, sexual harassment, police brutality that we see, or war for that matter, all comes from this absence of expansion of consciousness. The consciousness of people becomes so constricted that they cannot see outside of their own survival. Only I matter, nobody else matters.
What role does creativity play in the ascent of humanity, and how is creativity, or rather, how is creative insight understood differently in quantum perspective?
Yes, in quantum physics, creative insight is the quantum leap. I mean, what quantum physics does, Newtonian physics has blinded us into believing that the world really is local. No communication is possible without signal. World is continuous. Everything is connected with everything else in a continuous way in time. Nothing is discontinuous, happening with discontinuity in time. We cannot connect the past with the present, those kind of situations, which we call quantum leaps. When an electron jumps from one atomic orbit to another, it does not go through the intervening space. You cannot give any causal reason of when the electron will jump and where it will jump.
Which is one of the theories regarding the fossil gap, right?
Yeah, which is exactly what defines which explains the fossil gap. There must have been quantum leaps of evolution. Exactly. So these quantum leaps occur in creativity, and that is the major difference between quantum theory of creativity versus ordinary theories of creativity. They think it's all, we figure it out, we figure out everything. We figure out everything because some people have access to deep levels of the brain, which other people don't, which is all nonsense. Brain is brain, and there is access is achieved by memorizing. And yes, some people have good memory, but that does not make them creative necessarily. So the basic point then is that this discontinuity has to be emphasized in addition to continuity in our education. So
And I would think that non-locality would have a role in that quantum leap.
And non-locality, just as non-locality is important to understand that both signal-less communication and communication with signal are important. Similarly, both continuing operations and discontinuous operations are important.
Yes.
Yes, may I interject a question?
Go ahead, Suzanne.
Yeah, do any of your books or this particular book talk about information access in the non-local field? How that happens through the brain?
I do not write, I have not written any book explicitly on paranormal phenomenon, but in the book, God is Not Dead, in that book, there is a chapter. There is a chapter, whole chapter on paranormal phenomenon. So if you read that book, you will get a pretty good idea.
Okay. I would like one more thing, maybe others would like to know too. Do we have the opportunity to communicate with you through your website?
Yes, you do.
Where we could write you an email, perhaps? I would like to.
Info at amitgoswami.org. That will connect you directly to me. And
is there a dot in between it? Or is it continuous info?
Info at amitgoswami.org. No dot anywhere.
Okay.
AITGOSWAMI, one continuous word.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
We have a question from Joanne, who has her video off. In the chat, she asked, would the change in the midbrain be done genetically or behaviorally?
Well, the structure of the midbrain is, of course, genetically determined, but the function of the midbrain is behaviorally determined. So there is this question of hardware and software. The software is the part that is nature. And the hardware part is, software part is what is called nurture, and hardware part is called nature. Both are important. Both contribute to all of our organs.
And Maria, you wrote a question in the chat. Would you like me to read it, or do you want to ask it out loud? Just
the first one is, what does he think about the new findings below the Egyptian pyramids? And is this an example of our expansion in consciousness?
What did they find?
The pyramids are interesting because it is more and more appearing that the pyramids have been built much longer before we thought they are built. The latest data that I became very interested in is that there is a pyramid which is 27,000 years old. Believe it or not, 27,000 years old. That throws out all of our misconceptions about being hunters and gatherers. Hunters and gatherers cannot build pyramids. They have no need to build pyramids. So we must have shifted from hunters and gatherers into a kind of much stabler societies long before we think we did. Could have been as large as 30,000 years ago. And this is the theory that we're proposing. We are proposing that during that long period, 30,000 years to 12,000 years, when agriculture became more and more large scale, or 10,000 years, so give and take a couple of thousand. In that huge number of thousands of years, there was gradually community building, non-local society, and that's what we call the Golden Age, or if you will, Garden of Eden.
Which mainstream science does not recognize that Golden Age, does it?
Not yet, but scientists. I get my data from scientists, so not all scientists are obviously prejudiced. I mean, archaeologists discovered these pyramids, and they themselves are wondering what happens to how could hunters and gatherers could ever do this. They themselves are suggesting that we must have changed over to another kind of society.
Yeah. And another term for the Garden of Eden is the Satya Yuga, right? So, and the theory of the yugas is that there are ascending cycles and descending cycles.
Yeah,
And-
well, then it's a question of making models. There is a descending model, and there is also ascension model. A descending model, in my judgment, is a limited descent. Yes, descent does occur, but it's a mixture of ascent and descent, because within the descent we find plenty of ascent. Ascent I already mentioned Pars Romana. I mean, it's an amazing 250 years during which there was no war in the entire Roman Empire. I mean, that's an amazing feat if you think about it.
That is impressive.
So it's ascent and descent, not just descent.
Yeah,
And-
true. Because if you consider when we went from the vital era to the rational era, we lost our connection with non-locality, but we gained the rational mind, which was
Again,
kind of lacking before.
Also, we did not lose the non-locality overnight. We lost it gradually.
Yes,
Look,
yes.
Even 100 years ago, there was so much more community. I mean, okay, you at least you look like you are in the late 60s. You have seen societies where there are community. When I came to America, which is back in 1963, the whole community, the whole neighborhood was a community. We knew every person living in the neighborhood. We used to go to people's celebrations. We used to, people, of course, our children, they also help in finding communities. That is true, that too. So it was very different than it is today. And then more recently, when I live in America, I don't know the name of any neighbors. Nobody asks me, who are you? Where did you come from? What is your intention? Nobody asks you anything. Nobody, of course, I similarly am culprit of not asking anybody anything, because I think, what would they think? Odd person. Why is it curious?
Yeah. That's very true.
Has changed. We have opted for separateness. This is a tendency that will go on for a while, and chaos and more chaos will occur. And the theory is that out of the chaos, there will be order. All of a sudden, there will be a quantum leap that we cannot foresee when that will happen. It may take 10 years, it may take 100 years. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny. It seems like, the Sri Yukteswar, his model for the yugas says that we are already in the ascending cycle. We are already out of Kali Yuga and we're in Dvapara Yuga. And I can see evidence of that in terms of more and more people waking up spiritually, right? I can also see objection to that, because it seems we're increasingly more polarized. And, as you mentioned earlier, this shift to totalitarian type authoritarian type government around the world, although maybe before it's too late, we'll see increasingly reasons not to, but so I can see what you're saying about increasing and decreasing,
Yeah, and out of which some chaos will take place.
Yeah.
Chaos cannot be avoided, in other words. I mean, in physical systems, often chaos is needed in order for order to come about.
Yes, and creativity. Creativity comes from chaos too.
Right.
Right?
Creativity often is favored if two opposites are drawn together.
Yeah.
Oppositional thinking, out of oppositional thinking, we have synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
Antithesis makes synthesis. That's
Yes.
another way of looking at it.
Anyone else have a question? Maria, you had a question about consciousness and unconsciousness.
Collective consciousness versus collective unconscious. It is kind of related to the idea that in order to change the world, you need to change yourself. And I feel like one of the main means of doing that is doing shadow work and then integration. But then I also feel like during COVID, there was this great collective consciousness where I feel, everybody sacrificed for the benefit of the whole. But and that was a conscious thing that was done. But I think about the shadows of the collective, and that you mentioned bringing lasting peace. And so, I remember talking to Gloria earlier about Hamas and Israel and talking about where am I like a terrorist, or where should I be more willing to die? And, obviously the ego. But I was just curious about that. Do you think about how the collective can expand its consciousness?
This is a difficult question to answer because obviously only a few, I mentioned 15%, but out of 15%, probably only even a smaller percentage can really expand their consciousness in a regular way. Unless we have expanded consciousness, it's really hard to see the relevance of the other. Why should I serve the society? Why should I work for you? When I can benefit myself, why should I give something to you? What do I owe you to give? Why should I? Why? And this is the reason that most people become selfish, because they see only selfishness around them, because selfishness gravitates people towards themselves. Similarly, of course, the people who are expendable, they gravitate towards each other, and therefore what happens is that we develop in a kind of a separate world. We live, you and I and everybody in this company, we live with people who are more into unity, and therefore they can understand our language. We are friends, we don't value friendship, we value altruism, we help each other out, and so forth. Whereas the other group is this polarization is very real. It's not just a political polarization, it's a social polarization based on this fundamental difference. And the difference is, I delved into history a little bit, and difference is very simple. Only 40% of humanity has altruism as an instinct. And a full 40% of humanity does not have altruism as an instinct. Now imagine if altruism is not an instinct for you. You would never have the concept of another person's need, that I need to help him, he is in need. This concept would never come to you. if you never got into altruism. So this good-evil separation that religions talk about is not complete nonsense. It has some basis. People are naturally altruistic and people are not naturally altruistic. And these two people's perception of the world are completely different. Okay.
At some point,
Thank you.
maybe the person who is living a self-centered life may discover that they're not happy and might look around to see who is happy and learn something, right? I remember I had a spiritual teacher many years ago who said he was American. He had studied in India for many years, but he was American. And he said, Americans are ripe for waking up because we're the most neurotic people on earth. And we have achieved, and this was back in the 70s, he said, we have achieved the standard of living that most of the world is still trying to achieve, and we're not happy. And so as long as you think that that's what's going to make you happy, you'll keep going for that. But once you've reached it and you realize there must be something else, then you start looking inside. You know, I thought that
there is truth in that. You know, there's a lot of talk about happiness today. I think that's a very good sign. That's a very good sign. Apart from peace, I mean, happiness is the other avenue through which we can get into the new world.
yes.
Why aren't we happy? The question is being asked more and more. Why are today's young people so unhappy? Of course, the answer is on one hand very easy. They don't have meaning and purpose. But why they don't have meaning and purpose? What, you know, everybody is getting the same high school education. What is missed in the high school education that divides some people from seeing that there is meaning and purpose in life, and others can see it so clearly? You know, these questions have to be raised, and people are not necessarily raising this question because, you know, reincarnation is an idea that is a very hard sell for many scientists. They refuse to, although the data is enormous, I have given a completely acceptable theory. So anyway, we'll see. We'll see.
Well, Amit, I don't want to keep you. I know that you have other commitments, and I just want to hold up your book one more time, The Ascent of Humanity, Quantum Biology and Our Future. And thank you so much for joining us and for your wisdom and your expertise and your generosity of spirit. And thank you all for attending, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
And I would like to say thank you very much also. Beautiful, beautiful thinking for, we hope in the future for beautiful times to come.